Welcome to the Galactic Academy, where the brightest minds from across 17 star systems come to learn, grow, and occasionally wet themselves in terror during Professor Greg's xenobiology lectures. If you've never seen a 7-foot-tall Zephyrian have a nervous breakdown over a holographic projection of what's basically a space hamster, well, you're missing out on some premium entertainment. Professor Greg stood at the front of Lecture Hall Omega 7, his crystalline skin flickering between nervous yellow and full-blown panic orange as he adjusted his protective gear for the third time in 5 minutes. The guy treated every class like he was about to perform surgery in a plague ward. 6 different breathing filters, radiation-proof gloves, and what appeared to be a full-body force field generator humming quietly around his lanky frame. Students, today we will be observing, from a safe distance of no less than 50 meters, one of the galaxy's most feared predators, Grex announced, his voice crackling through the suit's speakers. The Class A designated Shadow Claw of Terminus Prime. Please ensure your emergency beacons are activated and your next of kin forms are up to date. The assembled students, a colorful mix of tentacled Aquarians, fuzzy Corvathians, and chrome-plated mechanoids, dutifully checked their safety equipment. Emergency beacon lights blinked green across the amphitheater like a constellation of paranoia, all except for one beacon in the back row that remained stubbornly dark. Jake Murphy, the Academy's first and only human exchange student, was slumped in his chair with the kind of posture that suggested he'd rather be literally anywhere else in the galaxy. His emergency beacon sat unused on his desk next to a half-eaten sandwich and what appeared to be a crossword puzzle from last Tuesday's Galactic Tribune. The 22-year-old from Earth had sandy brown hair that looked like he'd stuck his finger in an electrical socket, and the tired expression of someone who'd been explaining to alien classmates for 6 months why humans didn't actually eat their young. Mr. Murphy, Professor Grex's voice carried that special tone reserved for students who make teachers question their life choices. Your safety equipment appears to be malfunctioning. Jake looked up from his crossword, blinking like he'd just remembered he was supposed to be paying attention. Oh, the beacon thing. Yeah, it's fine. I just don't really see the point. The silence that followed was the kind you usually get right before someone starts screaming. Professor Grex's skin cycled through at least 4 different shades of orange before settling on a particularly alarming shade of red. You don't see the point of emergency safety protocols when observing a creature capable of tearing through titanium hull plating with its bare claws. I mean, Jake said, gesturing vaguely at the massive containment unit taking up half the laboratory space. It's behind like 6 different force fields and what looks like enough armor plating to stop a meteor. Plus, it's probably just cranky because it's locked up in a box. I'd be cranky too. A collective gasp rippled through the student body. Somewhere in the 3rd row, a Corvathian student started hyperventilating into a paper bag, his fur standing on end, like he'd been struck by lightning. Professor Grex's eye stalks twitched. Mr. Murphy, the Shadow Claw is not cranky. It is a precision-engineered killing machine, evolved over millions of years to be the perfect apex predator. Its species has wiped out entire colonial settlements. There are entire sectors of space that remain uninhabitable due to Shadow Claw infestations. Right, Jake said, returning to his crossword. 7 letters, starts with M. Something about being misunderstood. The containment unit in question dominated the center of the laboratory like a technological fortress. Multiple layers of energy barriers hummed at different frequencies, creating a rainbow light show that was probably beautiful if you ignored the fact that it was designed to keep something very angry and very dangerous from eating everyone in the room. Warning labels in 43 different languages covered every available surface, along with helpful pictographs showing various ways a person could be graphically dismembered. Inside the containment field, barely visible through the multiple layers of protective barriers, something dark moved with liquid grace. Occasionally, a glimpse of obsidian claws or gleaming teeth would catch the light, just enough to remind everyone why they were maintaining a safe distance and keeping their insurance policies current. Now then, Professor Greggs continued, his voice only slightly hysterical, we will begin with basic observation protocols. Remember, no sudden movements, no loud noises, and absolutely no direct eye contact. The Shadow Claw can interpret any of these as aggressive behavior. He activated the primary observation screen, and the image of the creature appeared in high definition across the wall display. It was, Jake had to admit, pretty impressive. About the size of a large dog, but built like a panther that had been hitting the gym and possibly taking steroids. Its hide was midnight black, with what looked like natural armor plating along its spine and legs. The claws that gave it its name were indeed impressive, gleaming like obsidian daggers and looking sharp enough to open cans or alien classmates with equal ease. But as Jake watched the creature pace its containment area, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The way it moved, the way it kept looking toward the observation windows, the almost desperate quality to its restless circling. "Professor?" Jake raised his hand, causing several students to duck reflexively. "Has anyone ever tried just, talking to it?" The question hung in the air like a bad smell. Professor Grex's skin went through what could only be described as a rainbow of disbelief. "Talking to it, Mr. Murphy? It's a Class A predator, not a therapy patient." "I'm just saying, it looks kind of lonely in there." And that, as it turned out, was the exact moment when everything went spectacularly, wonderfully, and terrifyingly wrong. You know that moment in every disaster movie where someone says, "What's the worst that could happen?" and the universe immediately takes that as a personal challenge? Well, the Galactic Academy's maintenance department had apparently been watching too many Earth films, because at the precise instant Jake suggested the Shadowclaw might be lonely, a cascade failure rippled through the containment system like dominoes made of very expensive and very important force field generators. It started with a simple power fluctuation, the kind of minor hiccup that usually just makes the lights flicker and causes the coffee machines to dispense something that tastes vaguely like motor oil instead of the usual something that tastes exactly like motor oil. Unfortunately, the Academy's brilliant engineers had apparently designed the containment system with all the redundancy of a house of cards in a hurricane. The first barrier went down with a sound like breaking glass. The second barrier lasted approximately 3 seconds longer, which was just enough time for Professor Grex to make a noise that no sentient being should ever have to hear. By the time the third barrier failed, the Corvathian student in the third row had graduated from hyperventilating into a paper bag to full-blown panic-induced hibernation. Containment breach. Containment breach. All students evacuate to emergency shelters. This is not a drill, the Academy's AI announced in the kind of cheerful voice usually reserved for announcing lunch specials or reminding people to validate their parking. What followed was the most dignified evacuation in the Academy's history. If by dignified you mean a stampede of alien students trampling each other in their rush to get as far away as possible from the now very uncontained apex predator. Tentacles flailed, mechanical joints sparked from overuse, and at least 3 different species began shedding various bodily fluids in patterns that probably meant something very rude in their native languages. Professor Grex, meanwhile, had achieved what his species called transcendent panic, which was apparently a state of terror so pure that he simply fainted standing up, his protective suit keeping him upright like the world's most expensive scarecrow. Jake, who had been in the middle of erasing mistake from his crossword to try misread instead, looked up just in time to see the Shadowclaw step delicately through the wreckage of its containment field. The creature moved with the careful precision of someone walking through a room full of broken glass, which was actually a pretty accurate description of the situation. "Huh," Jake said, apparently the only person in the room still capable of speech. "Well, that's new." The Shadowclaw froze at the sound of his voice, its massive head turning toward the observation deck with predatory focus. This was the moment, according to every xenobiology textbook ever written, when Jake should have been running for his life while screaming apologies to whatever deity might be listening. Instead, Jake stood up, stepped over his abandoned crossword, and walked toward the emergency exit that led directly into the laboratory. "Murphy, no!" came a strangled cry from somewhere behind the barricade of overturned desks that his classmates had constructed in record time. "It'll kill you and then use your remains as dental floss." "Relax, Vennick," Jake called back to the Aquarian student whose tentacles were visibly trembling with terror. "Look at it. Does that look like the face of a mindless killing machine to you?" The Shadowclaw had indeed paused in what everyone assumed would be its immediate rampage of destruction and death. Instead of howling with bloodthirsty rage or sharpening its claws on the laboratory equipment, it was sitting, just sitting there like the galaxy's most dangerous and expensive guard dog, watching Jake with what could generously be described as curiosity. Jake punched in his student code at the emergency airlock, which was apparently designed by the same geniuses who thought 6 backup systems were 5 too many. The door slid open with a cheerful chime, because apparently the Academy's safety protocols had given up entirely on the concept of preventing students from doing stupid things. "Jake, buddy, pal, friend of mine," came another voice from the barricade. This one belonged to Torque, a mechanoid whose optical sensors were cycling through what was definitely a panic subroutine. "Remember when you said you wanted to live long enough to graduate? This is the opposite of that plan." But Jake was already stepping into the laboratory, his sneakers crunching on the debris from the containment system. The Shadowclaw's head tilted slightly, the way a confused puppy might look at someone speaking a foreign language. Hey there, big guy, Jake said conversationally, as if he were greeting a neighbor's dog rather than a creature that had allegedly devoured entire space stations. Rough day, huh? I bet it gets pretty boring being stuck in a box all the time. The shadow claw made a sound that was probably supposed to be a threatening growl, but came out more like a questioning rumble. Its tail, which was armored and spiked, and generally designed for maximum intimidation, gave what could only be described as a tentative wag. From behind their barricade, Jake's classmates watched in horror as he slowly extended his hand toward the apex predator, palm up, the way someone might approach a nervous animal at a shelter. "That's it," whispered Vennick, his tentacles now tied in what appeared to be religious knots. "He's lost his mind. The human has achieved terminal stupidity. We're witnessing the end of an entire species exchange program." But the Shadow Claw, rather than removing Jake's hand at the wrist as 17 different xenobiology textbooks said it should, leaned forward and sniffed his palm with the delicate curiosity of a creature that hadn't had a friendly interaction in a very long time. And then, in a moment that would probably require several emergency meetings of the Galactic Xenobiology Council, the most feared predator in the known galaxy very gently pressed its massive head into Jake's outstretched hand. "There we go," Jake said softly, scratching behind what he assumed were ears. "You're just a big softy, aren't you?" The Academy's emergency response team arrived exactly 12 minutes later, which was apparently a new speed record that would have been celebrated if they hadn't been expecting to find a laboratory with documents supposedly poisoning artistic tablets and spattering some blood spatters. Instead, they burst through the reinforced doors wearing full tactical gear and brandishing enough firepower to level a small moon, only to discover Jake sitting cross-legged on the floor, while the galaxy's most feared predator sprawled across his lap like an oversized house cat. Said Commander Brix, the Corvathian security chief whose fur was standing so far on end he looked like he'd been struck by lightning. "Is that thing purring?" "I think so," Jake replied, continuing to scratch what he'd decided were definitely ears, even if they were armored and slightly more triangular than Earth standard. "His name's Midnight, by the way." Seemed appropriate. The Shadow Claw, now apparently known as Midnight, made a rumbling sound that was indeed suspiciously similar to purring, if purrs could potentially shatter windows and make small children cry. Its massive tail, complete with natural armor plating and spikes that could probably puncture starship hulls, was wagging with the enthusiasm of a dog who'd just discovered bacon. Commander Brick's tactical team, who had trained extensively for scenarios involving hostage situations, alien invasions, and the occasional food fight in the cafeteria, had not prepared for a situation that could best be described as aggressively friendly. "Murphy," Briek said carefully, his weapon still raised but looking increasingly ridiculous, pointed at what was essentially the galaxy's most dangerous lapdog. "Please step away from the Class A predator before it realizes you're made of meat." "Actually, I think he figured that out already," Jake said, as Midnight began enthusiastically licking his free hand with a tongue that was roughly the size and texture of sandpaper. "He doesn't seem to mind. Do you, buddy?" Midnight's response was to roll onto his back, exposing an armored belly, and looking at Jake with what could only be described as hopeful expectation. "Oh, you want belly rubs? Who's a good apex predator? You are. Yes, you are." The sound Commander Brix made was somewhere between a whimper and the noise a dying star makes when it collapses into a black hole. Behind him, his tactical team exchanged glances that clearly communicated their collective realization that their training manual had not covered what to do when the human starts giving belly rubs to cosmic horrors. 20 minutes later, Director Voss of Academy Administration found herself staring at an incident report that her computer kept rejecting because its AI couldn't comprehend the sequence of events being described. "Let me understand this correctly," Director Voss said, her centaurian head tentacles writhing with confusion as she addressed the assembled witnesses. "A Class A predator escaped containment, and instead of the expected bloodbath, it's now playing fetch?" Through the laboratory's observation window, Jake could indeed be seen throwing what appeared to be a piece of debris from the containment system, which Midnight retrieved with the boundless enthusiasm of a creature who'd apparently been desperately lonely and was now making up for lost time. Professor Grex, who had been revived with smelling salts and was now sitting in a chair that was probably older than most star systems, stared at the scene with the hollow expression of a man whose entire world view had just been fed through a blender. "In my 43 years of studying xenobiology," he said in a voice that suggested his sanity had packed its bags and left for somewhere more reasonable, "I have never seen anything like this. According to every piece of scientific literature ever written, that creature should have liquefied Mr. Murphy's internal organs by now." Maybe, suggested Jake, who had somehow acquired a piece of chalk and was playing what appeared to be tic-tac-tee with Midnight on the laboratory floor. Your literature is wrong. The silence that followed was the kind that usually precedes either enlightenment or complete nervous breakdowns. In Professor Grex's case, it appeared to be heading toward the latter. Wrong, he repeated, his voice climbing toward frequencies that probably violated several noise ordinances. 43 years of research, peer-reviewed studies, documented cases of entire colonies being… Yeah, but when was the last time anyone actually tried being nice to one? Jake interrupted, as Midnight carefully drew what might have been an X in the chalk grid, though it looked more like he was just happy to be included. I mean, think about it. You guys have been keeping them locked up in boxes, studying them like specimens, treating them like monsters. No wonder they get cranky. Director Voss felt a headache building behind her optical stalks. In her 2 decades of academy administration, she'd dealt with budget crises, interdimensional math professors, and that unfortunate incident with the quantum physics students who'd accidentally created a small universe in the supply closet. But none of those experiences had prepared her for filing a report that essentially boiled down to human befriends galaxy's most dangerous predator through the power of friendship and belly rubs. Mr. Murphy, she said carefully, while your approach appears to have been effective in this instance, I hope you understand that this creature is still classified as extremely dangerous. Jake looked up from his impromptu game, where Midnight appeared to have won through what was either strategic brilliance or complete accident. Dangerous to who? Look at him. He's just a big puppy who got a bad reputation because nobody ever bothered to get to know him. As if to prove Jake's point, Midnight chose that moment to roll over and present his belly for more rubs, making a sound that was probably supposed to be intimidating but came out as a happy rumble. Besides, Jake continued, obligingly providing the requested belly rubs, I think he was just lonely. Weren't you, buddy? Stuck in that box all by yourself, no pack, no friends, nothing to do but pace around and look scary? Midnight's tail wagging intensified, and he began making what could only be described as happy clicking noises. Director Voss realized she was going to need a very large drink and possibly a career change. The paperwork alone was going to be a nightmare. How exactly does one explain to the Galactic Education Council that their most dangerous specimen was apparently suffering from nothing more serious than social isolation and a lack of adequate belly rubs? We're going to need to run some tests, she said finally, though she wasn't entirely sure what those tests would involve. And probably rewrite several textbooks, and possibly rethink our entire approach to xenobiology. Jake grinned and gave Midnight one final scratch behind the ears before standing up. Sounds good. Can I help? I think Midnight would like that. As if understanding his new name, Midnight sat up and gave Jake's hand an affectionate lick that left it slightly damp but entirely undigested. Somewhere in the observation deck, Professor Grex made a sound like a deflating balloon and began muttering about early retirement and maybe opening a nice, safe flower shop on a planet with no indigenous life forms whatsoever. The emergency faculty meeting was called for 800 hours the following morning, which in academy time meant as soon as everyone could find enough caffeine to process what had happened without their brains leaking out their ears. The conference room looked like a support group for beings who'd witnessed the impossible, which wasn't far from the truth. Director Voss stood at the head of the table, her tentacles twitching with what her species called administrative distress syndrome. Around her, the Academy's finest minds sat in various states of bewilderment, clutching beverages that ranged from coffee to liquid nitrogen to what appeared to be glowing sludge. Ladies, gentlemen, and non-binary entities of indeterminate classification, she began. We have what I can only describe as a Jake Murphy problem. Professor Grex, who looked like he'd spent the night staring at the ceiling and questioning every life choice that had led him to this moment, raised a trembling hand. Director, I've been thinking, and I believe we may need to completely restructure our understanding of predator-prey relationships in the galaxy. That's putting it mildly, muttered Dr. Claxon, the Academy's head of interspecies psychology. The elderly Regilian's eye stalks drooped with exhaustion. I've been reviewing Murphy's file, and there's a pattern here that's frankly terrifying. Director Voss activated the main display, and Jake's student record appeared in all its horrifying glory. Please enlighten us, Doctor. Dr. Claxon stood up, his 3 arms gesticulating wildly as he began what was clearly going to be a comprehensive breakdown. Week 2 of Murphy's enrollment. Incident Report 1A. Student Murphy discovered in the botanical gardens, quote, having a tea party with the crystal spiders of Vega Prime. When security arrived, expecting to find Murphy's desiccated remains, they instead found him braiding flowers into the spider's webs, while the creatures, and I quote, appeared to be giggling. A collective shudder ran through the assembled faculty. The crystal spiders of Vega Prime were known for their ability to drain the life force from their victims through their bite. They were decidedly not known for giggling. Week 4, Dr. Claxon continued, consulting his notes like a coroner reading cause of death. The infamous slime creature incident. Murphy somehow convinced 3 andromedan acid slugs to, quote, perform synchronized swimming routines in the chemistry lab pools. The creatures, previously classified as violently territorial, began purring when Murphy scratched their, slime membranes. Professor Yarrick, the Academy's expert on toxic biology, made a noise that suggested his will to live was rapidly evaporating. Those creatures dissolve titanium on contact. Their bodily secretions are literally classified as a Class 5 biohazard. How did he even touch them without losing his hands? It gets worse, Dr. Claxon said, flipping through more reports. Week 7. Murphy successfully domesticated the terror moss in Greenhouse Delta 7. The moss, which had previously consumed 2 maintenance droids and showed aggressive expansion patterns, began producing what Murphy described as friendship flowers. The groundskeeping staff now requires psychological counseling. Director Voss felt her headache migrating to parts of her anatomy that shouldn't technically be capable of experiencing pain. How many incidents are we talking about, Doctor? 37 documented cases of Murphy befriending creatures that are classified as dangerous, hostile, or unsuitable for interaction with sentient life. The pattern is consistent. Murphy approaches creature, creature attempts to kill Murphy, Murphy either ignores the attempt or treats it as playful behavior, creature becomes docile and affectionate toward Murphy specifically. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Professor Grex quietly sobbing into his coffee cup. Dr. Claxon activated a secondary display showing security footage. This is from last month. Maintenance accidentally released a swarm of micro-drones from the Restricted Technology Archive. These are military-grade hunter-killers, programmed to eliminate any biological signatures within their operational parameters. The footage showed Jake walking casually through a corridor while being pursued by a cloud of tiny death machines. As they watched, Jake stopped, turned around, and began what appeared to be a conversation with the murderous swarm. He's talking to them, whispered Professor Nex, the Academy's leading expert in artificial intelligence. He's actually having a conversation with autonomous killing machines. Wait, it gets better, Dr. Claxon said with the enthusiasm of someone who'd completely given up on reality making sense. Watch what happens next. On screen, the drone swarm began moving in formation around Jake, eventually arranging themselves into what looked suspiciously like a conga line. Jake clapped appreciatively and began walking down the corridor with his new mechanical friends following behind him like deadly, hover-capable ducklings. The drones, Dr. Claxon continued, had to be manually shut down by the IT department because they refused to return to storage. They kept trying to follow Murphy to his dormitory. 3 of them are still unaccounted for, and we suspect they're living in his ceiling vents. Director Voss buried her face in her hands, or at least the Centauran equivalent. What are you telling me, Doctor? That Murphy is some kind of predator whisperer? That humans have some sort of supernatural ability to befriend dangerous creatures? I'm telling you, Dr. Claxon said, consulting his final notes, that based on behavioral analysis, threat assessment algorithms, and pure statistical improbability, Jake Murphy is functionally the most dangerous predator this Academy has ever encountered. And he doesn't even know it. The room fell silent except for the sound of several faculty members quietly updating their life insurance policies. Professor Grex looked up from his coffee cup, his face pale and haunted. You're saying that everything I've taught, everything I've studied, every classification system we've developed, it's all meaningless when humans are involved? I'm saying, Dr. Claxon replied, that we may need to add a new classification category to our threat assessment protocols. Something like harmless unless approached by humans, in which case becomes inexplicably friendly and may attempt to follow humans home. Director Voss realized she was going to need that drink much sooner than anticipated. And possibly a new job, preferably one that didn't involve rewriting the fundamental laws of xenobiology, because one cheerfully oblivious human couldn't stop making friends with things that were supposed to kill him. Schedule another meeting, she said finally. And someone find out if there's a manual for dealing with accidentally dominant species. I have a feeling we're going to need it. The ultra-maximum security wing of the Academy was the kind of place that required 17 different clearance levels. a psychological evaluation, and a last will and testament just to look at the floor plans. It housed the galaxy's most dangerous specimens, the ones so catastrophically lethal that even mentioning their names required special permits and a qualified therapist on standby, which made it the perfect place to test Jake's inexplicable ability to make friends with things that should rightfully turn him into component atoms. "I want to be very clear about this," Director Voss said, addressing the assembled observation team through the bunker's reinforced communication system. "This is purely for scientific research. We are not weaponizing Murphy. We are not starting an interdimensional petting zoo. We are simply trying to understand why the universe appears to have broken its own rules, specifically for one human with questionable survival instincts." The observation bunker looked like mission control for launching someone directly into hell. Screens monitored everything from atmospheric composition to Jake's vital signs, to the structural integrity of the facility's foundation, because apparently some of the creatures downstairs were heavy enough to affect local gravitational fields. Jake himself stood in the primary containment chamber wearing what could generously be called protective gear but looked more like a costume from a budget science fiction movie. The Academy's safety department had apparently given up on conventional protection and settled for, if he dies, at least we'll have good footage for the investigation. "Okay, Murphy," came Commander Brix's voice over the intercom. "We're starting with something relatively harmless, the Nebula Wraith of the Horsehead system. It's only killed, let me check, 43 research teams. But most of those were probably just bad luck." "Bad luck," repeated Dr. Claxon dryly, consulting his notes. "Yes, I'm sure the complete molecular dissolution of those researchers was purely coincidental." The first containment cell opened with the kind of mechanical grinding that suggested the Academy's engineers had watched too many horror movies. What emerged looked like a cross between a ghost, a jellyfish, and someone's worst nightmare about deep space. The Nebula Wraith flowed rather than walked, its semi-corporeal form shifting between dimensions in a way that made looking at it directly inadvisable for anyone who wanted to keep their sanity intact. "Hey there, beautiful," Jake said cheerfully, as the creature began manifesting what could only be described as tentacles made of concentrated darkness. "Rough day in interdimensional space? I know the feeling. Traffic's murder out there." The Wraith paused in what everyone assumed was the beginning of its reality-dissolving attack, tilting what might have been its head in confusion. It made a sound like solar wind through a broken radio, which the translation computers helpfully rendered as, query, "Are you food? You smell like food, but you are acting incorrectly for food." "Nah, I'm Jake. Nice to meet you. Are you hungry? You look hungry. They probably don't feed you enough in there." What followed was perhaps the most surreal conversation in the recorded history of xenolinguistics, as Jake somehow managed to convince an interdimensional horror that it didn't want to dissolve him into component particles, but would rather discuss the inadequate cafeteria service in ultra-maximum security. Within 10 minutes, the Nebula Wraith was wrapped around Jake's shoulders like the universe's most dangerous pet snake, purring in frequencies that shouldn't exist in this dimension. "Test 2, Director Voss announced, her voice carrying the flat tone of someone whose capacity for surprise had been permanently damaged. "Release the quantum screamer." The second cell disgorged something that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously and communicated primarily through inducing madness in anyone who heard its voice. It took one look at Jake, opened all 17 of its mouths to deliver a sanity-destroying shriek, and instead produced what sounded like a question. "Oh, you're one of those multi-dimensional beings, aren't you?" Jake said, as if this was a perfectly normal conversation starter. "That must be confusing. Do you need help figuring out which dimension you want to be in? Because you seem a little scattered." The quantum screamer, rather than driving Jake insane, began what could only be described as a consultation session about interdimensional travel anxiety. By the end of it, Jake was giving it what appeared to be breathing exercises, while it practiced existing in only 3 dimensions at once. "Test 3, Director Voss said, her voice now completely devoid of emotion. "The devourer of worlds. Murphy, this creature has literally consumed entire planets. It is a walking extinction event. Please approach with extreme caution." "Got it," Jake said, as a creature the size of a small building emerged from the largest containment cell. The devourer looked like someone had taken every nightmare about cosmic horror and given it far too many teeth and an attitude problem. Its very presence made reality seem less real, as if the universe was having second thoughts about allowing it to exist. Jake walked up to it with the casual confidence of someone approaching a friend's dog. "Wow, you're a big guy, aren't you? And those are some impressive teeth. Do they hurt? You look like you might have some dental issues. When was your last checkup? The devourer of worlds, ender of civilizations, consumer of suns, paused in what was presumably going to be Jake's immediate consumption and made a sound that the translation computers rendered as, ow. Yes, teeth hurt, long time since dentist. Embarrassed to ask. Well, that explains the whole planet-eating thing, Jake said sympathetically, reaching up to examine the creature's massive mandibles. You're probably just trying to find something that doesn't hurt to chew. Have you tried softer foods? Maybe some nice soup? 20 minutes later, the devourer of worlds was lying on its back, while Jake scratched the scales on its belly, making happy rumbling noises that registered on seismographs 3 star systems away. In the observation bunker, Professor Grex was making a sound like a tea kettle that had achieved sentience and immediately regretted it. This is impossible. This violates every known law of predator-prey dynamics. The devourer is literally a cosmic force of destruction. It shouldn't have feelings about dental care. Test 4, Director Voss continued, because apparently today was the day they were going to break the universe's logic entirely. The Mind Ripper. It feeds on conscious thought and leaves its victims as empty shells. Murphy, please don't let it eat your brain. We have paperwork. The Mind Ripper emerged from its cell-like liquid nightmare, all tentacles and psychic hunger. It immediately began attempting to devour Jake's consciousness, which should have left him a drooling vegetable within seconds. Instead, Jake tilted his head thoughtfully and said, "Are you trying to read my mind? Because I should warn you, it's pretty chaotic in there. I've got like 3 different songs stuck on repeat. I keep thinking about whether I remembered to do my laundry, and there's this weird thing where I imagine conversations with my high school math teacher. You sure you want to deal with all that?" The Mind Ripper recoiled as if it had tried to drink from a fire hose filled with caffeinated chaos. It made a sound that translated roughly to, "What is wrong with your brain? It is very loud and confusing. Also, why do you know so many lyrics to Earth advertising jingles?" "Sorry about that. Want a head pat instead? You look like you could use some affection." Within minutes, the Mind Ripper was making happy chirping sounds as Jake scratched what appeared to be its favorite spot, behind its primary sensory cluster. Director Voss realized that she was watching the complete collapse of everything she thought she knew about the universe. In the space of one afternoon, Jake had successfully befriended 4 creatures that collectively represented the end of civilization as they knew it. "Sir," came a voice from the communications station, "we're receiving incoming transmissions from several dozen news networks. Someone leaked the security footage. The headline on Galactic News Network is, 'Human gives cuddles to cosmic horrors, universe confused.'" Director Voss closed her eyes and began mentally composing her resignation letter. Somewhere in the background, she could hear Jake asking the assembled apocalyptic entities if they wanted to play a game of charades. It was going to be a very long day. 6 months later, the Galactic Xenobiology Council convened for what historians would later record as the Great Reclassification Crisis of 2387, though most of the beings present preferred to call it the day Jake Murphy broke science. The council chamber on Centauri Prime was packed with representatives from 47 different species, all of whom looked like they'd rather be literally anywhere else in the galaxy. The emergency session had been called after Jake's cuddle videos had gone viral across 17 star systems, causing mass panic, philosophical crises, and at least 3 religious schisms. Council Prime Exendara, a dignified Alterian whose tentacles had developed a nervous twitch over the past 6 months, called the assembly to order, with the weary tone of someone who'd spent half a year explaining to the galaxy why their fundamental understanding of predator classification was apparently wrong. "Esteemed colleagues," she began, "we are gathered here today to address the ongoing crisis in xenobiological classification, caused by the human." She said the last part like someone announcing a terminal diagnosis. Dr. Vexton of the Regelian Science Consortium stood up, clutching a datapad that looked like it had been through a blender. "Council Prime, the situation has become untenable. We've received classification revision requests for over 4,000 species based solely on security footage of one human undergraduate giving belly rubs to things that are supposed to end civilizations. The Andromedans are demanding we reclassify their sacred terror beasts as misunderstood puppies," added Dr. Klin from the Vegan Collective, her voice carrying the exhausted tone of someone who'd been dealing with very angry religious leaders. "Their entire mythology is based on these creatures being unstoppable forces of divine wrath. Now their children want them as pets." Council Prime Exendara's tentacles twitched more violently. "What's the status of our current classification system?" Professor Grex, who had somehow been dragged out of his attempted early retirement to serve as expert witness, stood up with the bearing of a man who'd watched his life's work become a comedy sketch. Counsel Prime, after extensive analysis of the Murphy incidents, we've been forced to conclude that our traditional threat classifications of classes A through S are inadequate. He activated the main display, showing the Academy's new threat assessment protocol. We've implemented a revised system with the following categories: dangerous, moderately dangerous, mildly concerning, needs therapy, wants belly rubs from humans, and the newly created classification, desperately lonely but previously misunderstood. A collective groan rose from the assembled representatives. 67% of our previously Class S extinction event creatures now fall into the wants belly rubs from humans category, Professor Grex continued with the enthusiasm of someone reading obituaries, including the Void Kraken of Nebula 7, which has apparently been depressed for the last 3,000 years because nobody ever visits. Dr. Takala of the Syrian Medical Institute raised a tentacle. What about the psychological impact? We're seeing widespread cognitive dissonance across multiple species. The Corvathians have started a support group for beings whose worldview has been fundamentally shattered by watching security footage of humans playing fetch with cosmic horrors. The Zephyrians are worse, added Dr. Mullix, consulting his own increasingly coffee-stained notes. Half their population refuses to leave their houses because they're convinced that if cosmic destroyer entities just needed friendship, then nothing in the universe makes sense anymore. The other half have started trying to hug everything dangerous they encounter. Their emergency rooms are overflowing. Counsel Prime Zendara felt a familiar headache building. What's our current status with Murphy himself? Director Voss, who had somehow avoided her planned resignation and was now sporting what appeared to be permanent stress patterns in her skin coloration, activated a secondary display. Murphy has been promoted to Chief Friendship Officer at the Academy. His official duties include therapeutic consultation with previously hostile entities, interdimensional diplomatic relations, and what our insurance company has classified as impossible pastoral care. The display showed recent footage of Jake leading what appeared to be a group therapy session in one of the Academy's larger auditoriums. The participants included the Shadow Claw, now known as Midnight, 3 quantum screamers who had formed what they called a dimensional anxiety support group, and the Devourer of Worlds, who was enthusiastically participating in what looked like trust-building exercises. He's also started a consulting business, Director Voss continued with the tone of someone reporting a natural disaster. Governments across the galaxy are hiring him to mediate disputes with dangerous wildlife. Last month, he successfully negotiated a peace treaty between the Terran Colonial Authority and a pack of stellar wolves. The wolves' primary demand was more adequate scratching posts and regular grooming services. Dr. Zenthis of the Galactic Wildlife Preservation Society practically vibrated with frustration. This is unprecedented. We've had to completely restructure our conservation protocols. It turns out that 90% of our aggressively territorial species are actually just socially awkward and need better communication skills. The crystalline hive minds of Proxima have started sending thank you cards. What about the broader implications? Asked Counsel Prime Zendara, though she suspected she didn't want to know the answer. Professor Grex activated one final display showing galactic-wide statistics that painted a picture of complete systematic upheaval. Contact protocols with previously hostile species have been revised. Tourism to formerly dangerous worlds has increased by 400%. The phrase, "Have you tried being nice to it?" has become the most commonly used solution in crisis management across 17 different governmental systems. And the humans? Counsel Prime Zendara asked, dreading the response. The humans, Director Voss said with the careful precision of someone delivering very bad news, have started an exchange program. They're sending more students. Jake Murphy was apparently not an anomaly, but rather representative of his species' approach to dangerous situations. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of several dozen beings quietly contemplating career changes. Dr. Klin cleared her throat. There is one more thing. The religious implications have been significant. Several major faiths have declared Murphy a divine figure. The Church of Cosmic Horror has renamed itself the Church of Cosmic Friendship. Their new holy text is basically Jake's approach to conflict resolution, which they've summarized as, "Have you tried belly rubs?" Counsel Prime Zendara buried her face in her tentacles. Are you telling me that one human undergraduate has accidentally become a religious figure while simultaneously destroying our scientific understanding of predator-prey relationships? Not just one human, Professor Grex corrected helpfully. Earth has apparently agreed to establish a diplomatic corps specifically for dangerous entity relations. They're calling it the Department of Interspecies Friendship. Their motto is, "No creature too scary, no situation too hopeless." The worst part, added Director Voss, is that it's working. Galactic conflict resolution times have decreased by 73% since implementing what they're calling the Murphy Protocol. Turns out most interstellar disputes can be resolved with active listening, appropriate snacks, and strategic application of belly rubs. Council Prime Exandara realized she was witnessing the end of an era, and possibly the beginning of something unprecedented in galactic history. Universal peace through the power of aggressive friendliness. Motion to adjourn, she said finally, and to establish a new scientific committee dedicated to understanding how one species evolved to be completely immune to appropriate survival instincts while somehow becoming the galaxy's most effective conflict mediators. As the council dispersed, many of them heading directly to the nearest bar, the display screens continued showing footage from across the galaxy. Humans cheerfully befriending creatures that had terrorized civilizations for millennia, dangerous entities learning to play board games and participating in group therapy, and a universe slowly adjusting to the idea that maybe, just maybe, everything scary just needed a hug. Somewhere in the Academy's student lounge, Jake Murphy was helping Midnight with his algebra homework, while the Devourer of Worlds offered helpful suggestions about quadratic equations. The Mind Ripper had discovered a talent for creative writing, and the Quantum Screamers were practicing their harmonies for the upcoming Academy talent show. Professor Grex, watching from the doorway, shook his head and opened his laptop. His resignation letter from xenobiology was already written. His application to the Academy's new Department of Interspecies Friendship, however, was looking more appealing by the day. After all, if you can't beat them, you might as well learn to give proper belly rubs. And somewhere in the back of his mind, he had to admit, the universe was probably a much friendlier place with Jake Murphy in it, even if it was also significantly more confusing.